Hi, this is Richard Edelman, and you're listening to the TrustMakers.
Hi, I'm Alex Heath, U.S. Head of Social Impact and Sustainability at Edelman. Today I'm joined by Michelle Milford Morse, the United Nations Foundation's Vice President for Girls and Women's Strategy. Michelle oversees organization-wide efforts to promote gender equality and the rights and agency of all girls and women. Throughout her career, she has worked on global health and development issues. I'm honored Michelle's taking some time out of the United Nations General Assembly Week to have this conversation with me. Michelle, welcome to the TrustMakers.
Hi, Alex. I'm so delighted to be here.
Tell us about the United Nations Foundation. How does UNF and your work relate to the United Nations itself?
Well, I work at a wonderfully unique organization that has a 25-year legacy of working with and for the UN on all the important causes that we care about. You mentioned this busy week. So New York City has a lot more people in it this week because they are all in and around the United Nations because we are talking about the Sustainable Development Goals, all 17 of them, a beautiful framework, and how to get them achieved. 193 member states signed on to them in 2015. We're at the halfway point, and we want to see the world raise its ambition and its attention to these goals so that we can get them done. But that's the kind of thing we do at the UN Foundation. We work on problems without passports, including climate, energy, and the environment, global health, girls and women's rights, and then also, of course, a functioning multilateral system where the nations of the world can come together to address big problems.
One of the problems without passports is some of the challenges that girls and women are facing all around the world, and you lead UNF's Girls and Women's Strategy. Now, not every foundation has a Girls and Women's Strategy. Why is this an important subject for UNF to focus on?
Well, let's start by saying every organization should have a Girls and Women's Strategy. I'm just lucky and so privileged to be at a foundation that not only prioritizes that, but has been since its very earliest days, since the first days of the foundation. We have a real habit, I think, in the global gender equality world of, especially not locally, but when we gather to talk about the world and the data about the girls and women in the world, we have a real tradition of admiring the problem. And so probably a lot of your listeners are very well aware of this. The fates and futures of half our human family are at stake in all the issues that we're here to talk about at the UN this week and in general all the time. It is true that our economic, social, our political systems are just not set up to ensure that girls and women in all their diversity have the same rights and expectations as all the boys and men in their diversity. And if you can look at the pay gap, you can look at the lack of care infrastructure. Do women get to control their bodies? Do they have control over their health? Do they have a right to rest? Do they have a right to rebel? Do they have a right to do anything? And all over the world, the answer is astoundingly and often no. Girls and women all over the world only have 3/4 of the same rights as boys and men. And that plays out in really pernicious and important ways. It is linked to whether or not we have pluralistic democratic societies. It's linked to whether or not we have growing economies. And it's linked to whether or not we have peace and security at home and abroad. And it is linked to whether or not we get to have thriving lives on a habitable planet. I think there are a lot of reassuring optics, both when it comes to gender equality, but also when it comes to gender equality in terms of women's economic participation. And the optics are reassuring because we can see women CEOs, women heading banks, and that's reassuring. It's very reassuring to me, even though overall the data shows that progress towards gender equality has been fragile and incremental and reversible and really slow. But I often tell people, and I often find they're shocked, that there was more women in the U.S. and global workforce in 1995 than there was before the pandemic. So the numbers in January 2020. And when the world gathered in Beijing at the Fourth World Conference on Women, there were 0 women who were CEOs of the Fortune 500 companies. And you might think, well, that was now what, almost 27 years ago, there must be tons of that. And there's not. This summer it was a big deal when we got just around 10%. So women's economic participation is something that we really need to focus on as a people, as long as our systems are organized around the idea that people need to work to secure their livelihoods, to take care of their families, and to grow our economies. It was interesting that in 2015, the McKinsey Global Institute put out this blockbuster study that everybody was quoting, constantly, the famous statistic in women's economic participation. And it said that if women participated equally in the economy, that by 2025, we could have $28 trillion in increased annual GDP. That's incredible, right? But unfortunately, the world greeted that with a bit of a yawn. We didn't do anywhere near enough to create the care infrastructure and the basic norms that would allow for women to participate in economies in ways that they wanted to do that. So I often think about that in terms of when, among your listeners who are leading companies, this is something we really want to focus on. Because the companies that create workplaces for women are the companies that are going to win. They're going to have better supply chains. They're going to win the recruiting battles. They're going to have higher profits. They're going to have more creativity. The data is really clear on that. So if you want all those things, you have to make sure that you're including women. Otherwise, it's like you desperately want a margarita, but you refuse to go out and get a lime.
So we've talked about the fact that we're here in New York during UNGA week. And you mentioned the halfway point of the global goals, the Sustainable Development Goals. What would make this week's sessions a success? And how does this week set us up to achieve or progress towards achieving the Sustainable Development Goals?
We are not on track. Part of that is definitely the pandemic. The pandemic set us back in truly dramatic ways across a range of indicators, from global poverty to hunger to learning loss among children. So the pandemic didn't do us any favors. But we weren't on track before the pandemic. And what is needed now to get us there is more curiosity and compassion, I believe, about all the ways in which these goals are linked, why they matter to the people of the world, and then also a lot more political will. One of the things I love about the Sustainable Development Goals is that they really are achievable. They are derived from years and years and years of consultations with people and governments all over the world. And there's a reason why there's 17 of them, right? This is what the world came up with for these goals. And they are absolutely achievable. They're aspirational, but they are achievable. So we just need more political will and more focus. The point of the UN General Assembly in a lot of ways is to summon that political will and that focus on these things, so that then delegations and civil society leaders of all types can go back to their countries and try again to keep ambition high and our focus steady.
And since we're coming to the end of this week, how are you seeing that having played out? Is the ambition high? Are people going back to their homes with greater will? How are people feeling about it? And how are you feeling about it?
I heard our president and CEO earlier this week say that she thinks maybe the penny has finally dropped on this one, and that she's hearing far more urgency from people. I have to say, I'm hearing that too in rooms that I'm in and in conversations that I'm listening to. A year ago, I heard more urgency out of people, and there was even more of that this year. The urgency, I think, is spiked with a little bit of anxiety and fear. I think it's safe to say that we live in precarious times, but I'm hearing a lot more urgency too. And a lot of people saying, I'm done talking about this. I want action, and I want it now. I am an optimistic person. I am not a catastrophist. I often tell people, yes, the world is going to end, probably not soon. So let's just get to work and get this done. I saw enough of that this week to leave me hopeful.
You've spent a lot of time in the UN this week and with political actors. I've spent a lot of time in the private sector this week with businesses, and your work includes frequent partnership with the private sector. So what are some current initiatives that bring UNF together with business?
We love working with the private sector. We think the private sector is critical. It's absolutely essential to get any of this work done. The UN Secretary General has said the private sector is essential to getting this work done. And for all the reasons that your listeners and others will understand, just the reach and the influence, the scale with which private sector leaders can employ vast number of people, influence policy, is enormously important. And over the past couple of years, and especially with regard to gender equality, we have found that business leaders are showing in lots of ways far more ambition when it comes to gender equality than even governments and heads of state. So we're quite eager, in fact, to work with the private sector. There's several ways that we get to do that. The UN Foundation, as I mentioned, is dedicated to bringing more voices, more ideas, more resources into the UN system. It's a really unique role we play. So sometimes that means that we are behind the scenes supporting a negotiation. Sometimes it means that we're out there driving great public awareness about an issue. But one of the things that I love that we do is we can gather private sector leaders around tables, and they can be really honest about how they're doing on things, for example, like gender equality. We do this all the time with a program we have called 5 for 5. So 5 goals to advance SDG 5. And those 5 are the ones that your listeners are probably grappling with right now. So you have to pay women equally. You have to make sure that you have really good leave policies, both sick and family leave. You have to make sure you have women at all levels of the company and all levels of leadership. You have to make sure that you have a safe workplace and really clear policies on safety at work. And then the 5th one, don't use diminishment and stereotypes in your advertising. Don't create or insist on stubborn gender norms. So we put lots of leaders around the table so that they can hash out, how do you get those things done? How do you grapple with the broken rung or the glass ceiling or the glass cliff or the motherhood penalty? We have phrases for all of these things because they are so stubborn and they are so entrenched. And my colleagues and I who work on this, we don't insist on perfection. We insist that you're trying. We insist that you want to learn. We insist that you see what we see, which is that number 1, workplaces that work for women are workplaces that work for everybody. We know a lot of deeply ethical business leaders are grappling with these questions and truly trying to figure out how to create workplaces that work for women. So we don't insist on perfection. We insist on an agreement that to grow economies, you have to have women as part of the solution. I was reminded earlier this week that Christine Lagarde once said that excluding women from the economy was like flying an airplane with one engine. You can do it. It's not a great idea. Probably not great for everyone on the plane. So we think about it like that. The other thing that we insist on is that this is not just a strategy that works for companies in industrialized nations and in the global north. In fact, there are ways to increase women's economic power, their agency, their economic security all over the world. And there are ways to do that by having better policies that ensure that workplaces that work for women, and also trying to move women out of insecure employment, inconsistent employment as well. And the last thing that we insist on is that companies can learn from each other and they can evolve and change over time. And so we like to create spaces through our 5 for 5 program for companies to do that. And we've learned so much from it.
You're really bringing business and NGOs together, and you're an NGO. According to our 2023 Edelman Trust Barometer, business is seen as the only competent institution. Mm-hmm. NGOs are seen as the most ethical. In practice, how do these two institutions complement each other?
I feel really lucky I get to work with both ethical and competent people across the private sector and across all of our civil society partners. I can definitely understand that perception as well. We do like that mix of groups. In fact, there's a lot of magic and power there. I was reminded too earlier this week that of one of the special and unique roles that we get to play, which is like that we can encourage the private sector to get involved in UN issues that they may feel a bit removed from the private sector. Like I think about, we have the With Her Fund. We work with the UN Spotlight Initiative, which is an SDG flagship fund. It's a highly effective EU-funded program that over the past 5 years has made a demonstrable difference on addressing violence against women and girls in countries all over the world. And we found that the private sector wanted to get involved in that effort, but they didn't know how to. and they needed a bit of a translator. They needed accompaniment to getting involved in violence against women, which for a lot of people is an issue that makes them deeply uncomfortable and makes a lot of people feel hopeless because it is so pervasive and it so undermines so many of our hopes and dreams for peace and prosperity, not just for girls and women, but for everybody. So we brought the private sector leaders along and we've said, we can help you make investments in this area at the UN Foundation. We can get money into the hands of grassroots feminist leaders. You don't have to be alone in trying to figure out how to address that problem, how to find effective organizations. And we will put you in a cohort with other private sector companies that are trying to be part of the solution too. And so that's an example of where we can blend the private sector and civil society in a way that both is effective and also helps everyone get done what they want to get done. I think that's a real sweet spot for us.
Let's stay on the topic of trust, and specifically in the NGO sector. NGOs used to be the most trusted institution in our annual study. And the 2023 Edelman Trust Barometer found that NGOs have fallen from trusted territory to neutral territory. Trust declined in 17 of 27 countries surveyed. Are you seeing that, and what might you attribute that to? You work with a lot of NGOs around the world. Why are people not trusting NGOs as much as they used to?
We're living in a time of complex and overlapping crises. The answers to those don't always feel abundant or obvious. And one could see why that people who are entrusted with bringing solutions, whether it is government leaders or civil society leaders who are addressing crises, one could understand why perhaps there is less trust. I've been thinking a lot about this question of trust. And a conclusion that I've come to is that the world largely doesn't trust women in positions of leadership, whether in a government or in a country or when they tell their own stories. It's a really hard thing to think about and to acknowledge. But earlier this summer, the UN put out a report about bias against girls and women. And it was a very well done survey. It covered a ridiculous percentage of countries in the world, and it found that 9 in 10 people hold bias against women as leaders. And the Reykjavik Global Index found the same thing when it was released late last year.
And this is 9 in 10 men and women.
Men and women.
Hold bias against women.
Yes, yes. So when I say we have a long tradition of not trusting women, I'm saying everybody. Young leaders don't trust women to be in charge. And they say that very clearly in survey data. And so I've been thinking about this question, like, what is so scary about a woman in charge? Because I don't find it scary at all. Or you think about the term feminist and how it's been so subject to misinformation and disinformation and co-opting and abuse, when it's just the idea that girls and women are fundamentally inferior to boys and men, and there are women who are not feminists, and there are men who are. So I've been thinking about this question of trust and how we can trust each other more to have our best interests at heart, how we can advance the best interests of all people, and create more inclusive systems and societies and political regimes and companies grounded in trust. But I do think it's difficult in times where there's a lot of precarity, and we are dealing with a lot of precarity and a lot of insecurity in the world, given these competing and complex crises. One of the ways that our team and the UN Foundation is trying to foster and support these notions of trust is by being a source of really consistent, reliable data about what is happening in the world, how it is affecting people, and just repeating it over and over again with a lot of clarity and a lot of calm. And then in the best cases, matching stories to that so that your curiosity and your compassion about the lived experiences of others can be nurtured as we think about the world and its people and what we have to do. But I'm very curious about this notion of trust, and I'm really glad that Edelman is keeping its eye on trust and how it's moving and how we can deepen trust among peoples, because we're going to need it if we're going to get anywhere. It's the only way we can cooperate and advance our interest.
A lot of what we talk about collectively in our impact space is the dynamic between the complex world we live in, which you already talked about, the multitude of crises and the complex crises that are occurring everywhere we look, and this need for real collective action, not just to do small things, but to advance systems change. You've been talking about systems change this whole time. This is deep, deep systems change work. So for our listeners, how would you advise them about how they should think about navigating the moment we're in? So all of us are moving society forward together so that we realize the ambition of these achievable SDGs. How can we do this together?
It's kind of the beauty of the UN, right? A place where our fates and futures are tied, where we address problems without passports. And the best moments this week for me were the ones in which I was in a place where I got to hear two people say, we should work together on that. And happily, I heard that a lot this week. But I also want to say we should adopt some collective solidarity and resilience. I think sometimes we think about these really complicated problems, and it's really tempting to think, well, we can't achieve any of that. So let's think small and let's be a little bit resigned. And I have to think about that every morning when I start my day, because depending upon the report you like and the data you want measured, from UN Women to the World Economic Forum, all the data tells me that we're not going to get to gender equality for somewhere between 130 to 300 years. It's really good data, and that's what it says. It means every single morning that I wake up, I'm set up to be disappointed and to have my heart broken. I got to really think about the long term and really apply some resilience to this and to not give up. So I think that if we are committed to looking at each other in the eye, thinking about the long-term advantages of more equality, more peace and security on a thriving planet, then we're going to have a better shot at getting some of this done. So there are people listening. You have some power to unlock, and you know someone else who needs that power, and you have interests that you want advanced, and there are people who have the same interest. That exchange is where a lot of things can happen. It's why I think the UN is a really beautiful place. It's why I think that we can achieve these things. So let's find ways to work together and to not give up.
On that note, that's all the time we have for today. Michelle, thank you for sharing your insights and your expertise. And to our listeners, thank you for listening to the TrustMakers.
Thank you for tuning into the TrustMakers, an Edelman podcast in partnership with Advertising Week, where we speak with leaders and other trust builders across institutions. See you next time.